So really originally the title for this last and final session was The Next 75 Years, and I am going to talk about the next 75 years, but one cannot avoid a discussion about what is happening now. And what is happening now is dramatic. I was right after the elections, I was interviewed by Christiane Amanpour on CNN. And I think some of you saw me live and sent me text messages. And I said, even without knowing what is the exact plan of the current coalition, I said that we are looking at a revolution, no less. And Christiane Amanpour was shocked. She said, are you using the word revolutionaries? I said, yeah, that's who they are. I said, that's the plan. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. So what I'm going to do today is we'll start with some brief discussion of the first 75 years, and then we'll jump into the current crisis. So when and this is really the story of what we covered here in the first four sessions, because when you look at the state of Israel, historically, the state of Israel is the outcome or the product of an effective strategy from a business point of view, right? When I teach at NYU or Tel Aviv U, and I teach about country branding, I look at Israel as a big success story, and I introduce Israel as a huge success story because here's a perfect example of a strategy was articulated by people like Theodor Herzl and his generation, and then two people, Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, who were able to execute the strategy and create something that is unquestionably a stunning success. The strategy was, of course, statehood, and there were two main achievements to Israel as a strategic phenomenon. The first is Israel's security doctrine, which was designed largely by David Ben-Gurion himself with help of many volunteers from within the ranks of the Zionist movement and from world Jewry, most notably people like Colonel David Mickey Marcus. And that stands, Israel's security doctrine, which has proven to be a phenomenal success, stands on three legs. They need to protect the Israeli and the Jewish people. If you remember the raid on Entebbe, for example, most of the people that were abducted there were not Israeli. They were actually members of the Jewish community. So in order to protect, you have to have a large army. That's the IDF. Prevention. In order to prevent, you have to have very good intelligence, and Israel is investing a lot in its intelligence. And the need to deter, and in order to do that, you have to develop mighty weapon systems and mighty capabilities that will deter your enemy. And again, I don't have to tell you, you read about those things all the time. So that has been a great success. The other part of it, which you guys have a lot to do with, is the fact that Israel emerged as a knowledge-based economy. The roots of that stem from not only Herzl's vision. If you read Alt-Neuland 1902, Herzl talks about the future Jewish state as a beacon of science and knowledge. In fact, he predicted a startup nation. He even predicted that that Haifa would become a major hub. Back then, 1902, Haifa was a fisherman village. And so, again, Chaim Weizmann took upon himself to execute that part of Herzl's vision, and he recruited Albert Einstein. Before we started with this program, we were chatting about the Genius 100 community, and Albert Einstein's birthday was yesterday. And really, the Arab economic boycott was the final straw that pushed Israel in that direction, because an idea, unlike a building, unlike a physical structure, unlike a human being can be imprisoned, a building can be destroyed, but an idea cannot be destroyed. Nothing can destroy an idea. And the state of Israel became a producer of solutions in a global scale. to global problems. And you see that in the academia, where Israel is punching way above its weight. You see that in technology, in life sciences, and again, David Milch here is an investor in Israeli life science because he believes in Israel. And you see that obviously in Israeli industry. However, there's a big however. When you look at cases of structures that collapsed without any external intervention, you usually identify early deficiencies or early errors that were made in the process of construction. Right? I was just last month, I was in Florida, and I had a chance to meet an old friend who lost her husband in the collapse of the Surfside building. It was a very, obviously, a very tragic situation for her and for her family. But then I read about it, and why did the building collapse? And obviously, all the assessments referred to early design deficiencies. And in that case, I believe that one of the things I read was that they used the wrong materials in the mixing of the concrete that corroded the beams, the steel beams. So what were the early design deficiencies that the founders of the State of Israel made? Most notably two. The first is the fact that the State of Israel was founded with no constitution. And the second is that there was no separation between religion and state. Why that? Why no separation between religion and state? First of all, it's the British heritage. We have to remember that the British ruled this part of the world from 1917 until practically the establishment of the State of Israel. And they brought with them a great deal of influence, physical influence and conceptual influence. Physical, even until this very day, you look at the infrastructure of the State of Israel, a lot of it was designed by the British. The original blueprint for the city of Tel Aviv by a Scottish architect whose name was Geddes was introduced in the mid-1930s. The big blueprint for the future of Tel Aviv, the urban future of Tel Aviv. Not to mention the police stations, the highways, the roads at the time, and so on. But the political system came with the Brits. They also were the ones who introduced the idea of a chief rabbi. Chief rabbi is something that was never known in Jewish diaspora life. There were no chief rabbis. On the contrary, the Jewish community was known for its resilience because of the fact it was a network of connected communities and a constant argument between religious rulers and rabbis, but there was never a chief rabbi. And the idea of a chief rabbi came from the British mandate. So no constitution, no separation between religion and state. And the reason for it was very simple. David Ben-Gurion, just as the war ended with the armistice agreements in 1949, couldn't reach white consensus for one, especially not with the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox representative at the time. And he, in many ways, was part of that Israeli culture that stays with us until this very day. All of us who do business with us, with Israelis, know Israelis, from a cultural point of view, will always give precedent to the urgent over the important. Israelis are very good at improvising, crisis management, coming up with solutions, not very good about thinking long-term, implementing long-term strategy. They really don't have the patience for it. And as a result, the urgent always overrides the important. And then lastly, obviously, Ben-Gurion had bigger fish to fry, as you say in American. He had bigger problems. And the idea was, instead of trying to reach a constitution, instead of engaging in a fight with the Orthodox, let's give them what they want. And let's enact a series of basic laws that one day will amount into a full constitution. That was the idea. Now, add to that, to those historical roots, those two historical errors that were made in the building process of the state of Israel that are now coming back to haunt us. Add to that all the things that we mentioned in each and every session, the devastating implications of the information revolution. This is Israel's Brexit moment. Why is it Brexit moment? Because just like in Brexit, and again, it doesn't matter where you stand on Brexit. You can be for it, you can be against it. There's no argument that Brexit represents a yearning for simple solutions, right? And what's happening here is that Israelis are being told that all their problems begin and end with the judiciary. That's the simple solution. This is the Brexit moment of Israel. And today we're going to talk about that. Is it really the case? What is it that the sides are claiming? And we'll try to answer some of your questions. And then, of course, because of information revolution, what you're seeing is not only the rise of populism all over the world, because by definition, populism is based on the ability to articulate, to craft and then articulate a very simple message, which we call the populist message of us, the masses against the elite. In this case, in Israel, just like what you experienced in the United States on January 6th, we're also looking at a very specific genre of populism known as anti-state populism. When the populists attack, it's like an autoimmune disease, attack the institutions of the state. In this case, the institutions under attack are the Israeli police, the Israeli army, the Israeli civil service, and of course, the judiciary. And again, we'll talk about that at length today. So there was no constitution, as I mentioned, but there was a proclamation of independence from May 14th, 1948. And that's a very progressive document, even in today's terms, inspired by the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations was created only 3 years earlier in San Francisco, initially with 51 countries signing the United Nations Charter. Again, I urge all of you to go online, read the UN Charter. For its time, highly progressive document. And the same thing can be said about Israel's proclamation of independence, where a commitment to keep Israel as a democracy is being articulated. There's a focus in the document on justice, social justice, and democracy. It even talks about minorities in terms that today are very, very common because of the whole conversation about diversity and inclusion, but it was already in the Proclamation of Independence. So the Proclamation of Independence is the spiritual basis of the interpretation made by Israel's judiciary to the Israeli law. Because there is no constitution, what does it mean? It means it's very difficult to play a game without rules. In the United States, when the Supreme Court is, not just the Supreme Court, any court, the Constitution is providing them with the basic ballpark. Now imagine that you're playing baseball with no ballpark. Very difficult. That's what happens when you don't have a constitution. So the Israeli Supreme Court has to be extremely creative, Israeli courts in general, in order to interpret the law, because we don't have a constitution. We don't have those clear boundaries that are sacred and they're acceptable by all players in the political system. And that's very, very difficult. It makes Israeli democracy very vulnerable, and it really cripples the checks and balances that are really the lifeline of every and any liberal democracy. So we spoke about it here before. Historically, what are the origins of Israeli democracy? So as we heard, there are several common explanations. One of them is that it comes from the Bible. That's not true. Israeli democracy there is no evidence in the Bible that we were a democracy. Another explanation is that it stems from the work of those who interpreted the scriptures, what we call Jewish thought. Not true. There's no evidence of democracy there. A third common explanation is that Israeli democracy is a result of the fact that the founders of the State of Israel came all from Europe, where countries had already in the beginning of the 20th century some democratic traditions. Not true. The founders of Zionism came from Tsarist Russia. They came from monarchies. They came from some of the worst regimes in that time in the world. Not true. So where did it come from? And as I mentioned here before, Professor Shlomo Avineri wrote a beautiful piece in Haaretz several years ago in which he argues that their origin really is from the way Jewish communities conducted their own affairs in the diaspora for millennia. And of course, by 1917, with the introduction of the Balfour Declaration and the British Empire beginning its mandate over Palestine, certainly British influence has a lot to do with the fact that Israel became a democracy. Nevertheless, because of those origins, Israeli democracy is very fragile. My dear friend, Professor Kenneth Stein from Emory, provides this description of where Israeli democracy actually came from. And he talks about all those elements that are so characteristic to our life in the diaspora, whether you're a member of the Jewish community in Denver or in Tijuana, it doesn't matter. You have a communal focus, you have pluralism, self-governance, self-defense. You have to adapt to the non-Jewish world, and you have to build institutions, and you have to be stable, almost unending communal leaders who carried the baton for peoplehood forward. That's the story of where Israeli democracy came from. These are the origins of Israeli democracy. In many ways, the way you conduct your affairs in your communities. So why are Israelis demonstrating right now? What's the story? And we are having a wave of unprecedented demonstrations. It's true that during the First Lebanon War in 1982, 1983, there were big demonstrations too, but they were not as consistent and they were not as pluralistic. What you're seeing now is a creation of a new political reality, and I will explain what do I mean by that. Now, a few words about the checks and balances in Israel. Just like any other democracy, certainly parliamentary democracy, in Israel, we have three branches. We have the executive branch, the government, that its job is to run the country, make decisions, execute policy. The government is elected in elections. These are not personal elections. A lot of Americans and Canadians mistakenly think that Mr. Netanyahu was elected. No, Likud was elected, not Mr. Netanyahu. Likud was elected. And that's a very significant distinction. We have the judiciary branch, the Israeli judiciary, and we spoke about it here last time. And my dear friend, Judge Vic Bianchini from San Diego, who knows the Israeli judiciary very well, agreed with my statement that it really needs some improvement. Israeli judiciary is a bit broken. We have to admit it. The statute of limitations is not exactly what it should be. The cases are being lingering for years. The quality of judges is not so high, and so on and so forth. And then you have the legislative branch, which their job is to represent the sovereign. The sovereign is the people. Now, what's the problem? Israeli checks and balances are crippled to begin with. Why? Because the founders of the State of Israel made a decision that the legislative branch, and this is why it's marked here in red on the screen, the legislative branch will be 120 representatives of the people. But if to use an analogy from your world, America, Canada, then the entire country serves as one district. All 120 people come from the same district. What does it mean? It means that they do not have a clear constituency and they are not indebted to their district. And I gave the other day, I gave a similar talk here to Israelis the other day, and I gave them the example of what's happening now with the Republican delegation to Congress from the state of New York regarding George Santos. And I told them, and I'm, by the way, I'm fascinated by the case of George Santos. I'm fascinated by it because of the lies he picked. It's an incredible statement about the state of politics. And I don't think that by saying that George Santos is a little crazy, we're ending the discussion. I think it's much deeper than that. And I see a little bit of George Santos in many politicians all over the world. And it has a lot to do, again, with information overload and with people's reaction to what they think is expected of them, because he basically checked every box in his set of lies. Astonishing story. But you have Republicans, and I've seen them on television, who are demanding that their colleague from the congressional delegation will be dismissed by the House. Why? Why are they doing that? It certainly doesn't, it's not their political interest as Republicans. Well, the answer is very simple, because this is the demand coming from their constituency. How many of my friends here on the call, when they have a problem, they call their congressperson, the representative? It's not the case in Israel. In Israel, was those 120 members of the Knesset do not know exactly who their constituency is, other than the sectoral parties, like the ultra-Orthodox party and so on. Now, that is a dramatic difference between Israeli parliamentary democracy and, let's say, American or Canadian parliamentary democracy. Why? Because by definition, if the government is given the task of forming the coalition, and the government has a majority, whether it's a majority of 61 or a majority of 75, by definition, the Israeli legislative branch is operating under the instructions of the executive branch. So to begin with, because Israel has no districts, because the legislators do not have a clear constituency and they're not indebted to us, we begin the journey in 1949 with a huge deficiency. A big part of what is known as the checks and balances system doesn't exist in Israel because of that very reason. Now, add to that the fact that that some coalitions in Israel's history reached huge numbers. Like, I remember Ehud Olmert, for example, he inherited a coalition. He had a coalition of 75 members. Huge, 75, 80 out of 120. It means that the Knesset means nothing. And indeed, Israeli prime ministers, when you think about the biggest policy speeches that they gave in recent years, in the last 20 years, Ariel Sharon, when he wanted to announce a dramatic policy move, the disengagement from Gaza, where did he announce that disengagement? Not in the Knesset. He went to IDC, the Herzliya conference. Even Benjamin Netanyahu in 2009, when he gave the famous Bar Ilan speech about his commitment to the two-state solution, he chose to do it at a conference at Bar Ilan University, not at the Knesset. So the Knesset has never been weaker. And so that leaves the judiciary. Israeli court system, which I already said, certainly needs some work, certainly need an improvement. The Israeli judiciary is the only element that represents checks and balances in the Israeli system. It's the only supervision that exists over Israeli government, over the decisions made by Israeli politicians. And that's very important to understand. Now, the fear of Israelis, the short answer to the question why Israelis are demonstrating is this. Israelis fear that the intent of the executive branch is to make sure that the judiciary branch is operating under their supervision and not the other way around. And that is practically the end of Israeli checks and balances, and practically the end of Israel as a liberal democracy. Now, they tell us it's about governance. But the truth is that this is a pure political struggle. This has very little to do with governance. It has everything to do with political power. How do we know that? Because nothing in what is being proposed is dealing with the actual issue of improving the legal system, which needs more judges, needs more budgets, needs more facilities, needs better training, needs certainly some new regulations, but none of that is being discussed. All the things that are being discussed are about the relationship between the executive branch and the judiciary branch and who's controlling what. So I already mentioned the coalition is claiming that they're introducing a legitimate political reform, and the opposition is claiming that this is indeed a revolution and an attempt to change the Israeli system. What is the coalition's argument? The coalition's motivation? So the first thing I would say, as a person who knows some of the actors in this drama unfolding, the first thing I would say, these people are really genuine. They truly believe that democracy is all about procedure. They truly believe, and again, it's part of the way, the simplistic way people are now programmed to view the world because of information overload. They truly believe that democracy is about winning, and the winner takes it all. And when you win, you get to do what you want. And they make a cold political calculation that Israel is gradually becoming more and more conservative because of demography, because of the fact that the Orthodox are bringing, 6, 7, 8 children per family. And therefore, Israel's conservative future is secured. And they're rushing to introduce those changes that will cement their political victory and their political power, and they're fighting the elites. That's one motivation, which I believe is genuine. They truly believe that democracy is about a procedure of elections, and whoever wins gets to do what they want. Add to that years and years and years of perceived disadvantage. Why do I say perceived disadvantage? Because Israel is an immigrant society, and immigrant societies, by definition, every group of immigrants at one point felt disadvantaged. By definition. And so therefore, the disadvantaged of today are going to be the elite of tomorrow. That's what happened to my parents' generation, right? And so the Jews that came from Yemen, there were Jews that came from Yemen, like my mother's family in the early 20th century. Where did they come from? Were they members of the elite? What kind of absorption do you think they? But the Jews that came from North Africa in the late 1940s, early 1950s, think that their absorption was the most traumatic, and that they were exceptionally excluded by the elite. Obviously, they're all correct. Every group, and you look at the Ethiopians that came more recently, same thing. They also did not have an easy time. Even the Russians came in the early 1990s, over 1 million people. They had a difficult time. Every immigrant group can feel excluded, disadvantaged, disenfranchised in some cases. So there's an element of that. They want to compensate for perceived disadvantage and exclusion by the so-called elites. There's also an element of revenge. Famous Israeli author David Grossman published an article a couple of weeks ago in which he talks about revenge. They are not happy with just winning the elections. It's not enough for them. They want to crush the other side. They're being motivated by a strong sense of revenge. And then, of course, I mentioned it already, the belief that the judiciary is responsible for everything, which is a very curious thing, because when Mr. Netanyahu proclaimed that he was able to form a coalition, he mentioned 4 things that this coalition is going to do. Number 1 was Iran. He never even mentioned the judiciary. And all of a sudden, it becomes the biggest issue of his coalition. What we're seeing is also a product of radical and toxic ethnocentrism, meaning the inability of what is ethnocentrism is when a certain society is unable to experience the world through any other prism but its own. And that leads to a detachment from the international community. And what you're seeing now, again, it's very concerning to me, always had been concerning to me, is a political system that is unaware of how the world is perceiving their decisions. Completely unaware. That's a sign of ethnocentrism. And I already mentioned the political calculation that they're making. What is the argument that the coalition is making to support their steps? And I will describe the proposed steps in a second. So the first is as a struggle, an argument over the terminology that is going to be used. So the proponents of the plan to change, to basically make sure that the judiciary is subordinated to the executive branch, describe it as a reform, and they say that the purpose of the reform is to improve governance. Obviously, the opponents call it revolution, and they claim that it has nothing to do with governance. Mr. Netanyahu himself claimed that this is just like America. This is just like Canada. It's true. Canadian former Minister of Justice, our good friend Irwin Cotler, published an article that says it's wrong. You can't say that what you're proposing to do in Israel is like what's happening in Canada. It's not true. Same thing can be said about the American system. It's true that in the United States, the government gets to choose judges in the Supreme Court. But in the United States, you have Constitution. And the judges of the Supreme Court, their job is to interpret the law in reference to the Constitution. We don't have a Constitution. And of course, a reminder, they say we won the elections. Don't forget that. And they say that in almost every conversation. And lastly, their response is to delegitimize the protesters, which is something that really is enraging Israelis, describing them as anarchists and as illegitimate people, claiming that they're being funded by foreign governments, while there is no evidence that any of the demonstrations are being funded by foreign money. And all those things combined really fuel the protest in an unprecedented fashion. So what are the things that the coalition would like to change? The first thing is what we call the override clause, which means that the Knesset, which, as I mentioned before, is already controlled by the government, will be able to override Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority of 61. Currently, as it stands now, theoretically, although it was done very few times in history, The Supreme Court can strike down any law it finds to be unconstitutional, although, again, we don't have a constitution. With this change, the Knesset would overrule that decision and pass the law with the smallest majority. The Supreme Court is known to intervene twice in Israel's history. The first time was during Ehud Olmert's term as prime minister, when the Supreme Court intervened and forced the Israeli government to fund the construction of protection for the children of Sderot from rockets. And the second time was recently when the Supreme Court handed Mr. Netanyahu a major defeat when all 11 judges ruled against his attempt to appoint Aryeh Deri, a convicted felon who was convicted twice of embezzling money from serving as a minister of health and minister of the interior. And Mr. Netanyahu was unable to overcome the opposition of the Israeli Supreme Court. The second element that they're trying to introduce is to change what we call the test of reasonability. The Supreme Court would no longer be able to judge Knesset legislation, appointments, or other government decisions on the grounds of reasonability. The Supreme Court employed this standard recently when it ruled that Netanyahu's appointment of Aryeh Deri as minister is highly unreasonable. This is what I was referring to a second ago. And again, the same thing happened with Ehud Olmert 2007. Third element they're trying to introduce is to change the way judges are being appointed, right? The proposed changes would also change how Supreme Court justices are selected and give the ruling coalition effective control of appointing them. What's the danger of appointing judges by the government? And again, unlike the United States, the danger is that the judges will not be independent. They'll be indebted to the person who appointed them. And as a result, if they're not independent, then it means that there will be no effective supervision, judiciary supervision, over government decisions. It means that elected officials are going to be free to decide whatever they want. And if they have the majority, reality is going to be that the minority groups in Israel will suffer the most because the majority will decide whatever they want. And again, currently, the judges are being chosen by a committee. We talk about Supreme Court judges by a committee of 9 members. Now, again, it's very important that you understand that the Israeli court system has many issues and needs to be fixed. One of the issues is even nepotism, but mostly issues that are related to efficiency and, as we, term I like to use, quality. The quality of the Israeli court system is not very high. Supreme Court is of high quality, but by and large, the Israeli judiciary is not of high quality, and every person who ever dealt with the Israeli court system, every person who ever sat in front of Israeli judge knows that. The level is not very high, and it's not high because it was neglected by the Israeli government. And what they're doing is they're not proposing to change that or to improve that or to make any investment in the quality of the Israeli judiciary. And lastly, they want to basically eliminate the influence of legal advisors. Legal advisors are the people that work with the executive branch and basically provide them with legal advice. Now imagine you're going to build another section to your house illegally and you hire a lawyer, and the lawyer is telling you, I strongly advise you not to do that because it's illegal, and then you fire them because they don't tell you what you want to hear. That's the case. That's what they're doing here. They're saying, if the legal advisor is going to provide an opinion that is against the policy, then what do we need them for? That's what they're saying publicly. This is not even being said behind closed doors. That's what they're saying. If they're not representing us, then what's the whole point? If the legal advisor doesn't work for me, what's the whole point? I won the elections. Right? Now, those 4 steps I just showed you is what they describe as only the first step. Now, in Israel, in order for a bill to become a law, it has to pass 3 votes. There's a preliminary vote, and then there's 1, 2, 3 votes when it becomes a law. So right now, of the 4 things that I mentioned, 2 are already in advanced legislation, and there are no signs that the coalition is going to stop with with this process. So what are the possible scenarios? Scenario number 1, which cannot be ruled out, is the coalition will succeed. The protest will fail, and Israel will become de facto a crippled democracy, which means, and I will show you exactly what it means in a second, but it means that the world will no longer look at Israel as again, Western-style liberal democracy. Second scenario is a Netanyahu ouster. There are several possibilities for that. The first is some sort of a out-of-court agreement. Maybe the Israeli president will offer a pardon even before the outcome of the trial, and in return, Mr. Netanyahu will retire. Highly unlikely, because in Israel, a sacred principle is equality, and the law in Israel, the prime minister doesn't have any special immunity. On the contrary, from a legal point of view, the higher standard, and so are other elected officials in Israel. Another scenario for Netanyahu's ouster is when the Supreme Court will reach a point in which they will say Mr. Netanyahu is in a clear conflict of interest when he's dealing with changing the judiciary, the very same judiciary that is discussing his legal fate. Then obviously that's a classic conflict of interest. And Mr. Netanyahu is trying right now to pass a law in the Israeli Knesset that will block the Supreme Court from announcing him unfit for the job. Now, because Likud won the elections and not Mr. Netanyahu personally, there is a scenario that the Israeli Supreme Court may rule, and in fact, that petition was already presented to them, may rule within 3-4 weeks that Mr. Netanyahu will order Likud to replace Mr. Netanyahu. And then Likud will have to decide what to do. And that's a real scenario. That's a real scenario that can happen in a few weeks. When Likud will be ordered to replace Mr. Netanyahu, and Likud then will have to decide what to do. And here, obviously, there are 2 options. Either Likud complies or not. If Likud does not comply, then Israel will be facing the most serious constitutional crisis in its history, and perhaps the most dangerous moment in Israel's existence. And I'll explain why, because it will boil down to the decision of the executives. Who do I comply with, the judiciary or the government? And the head of the Israeli police will have to decide. He already gave us a hint last week when he was ordered by the Minister of Homeland Security, who has no authority by law, to fire the commander of the Tel Aviv district, because the Minister of Homeland Security was supposed to be the minister of all of us in true democratic fashion, because he felt that the commander of the Tel Aviv district is too the commander, the head of Israeli police, Mr. Shabtai, first complied, fired him, and he had the authority to do it. And then, quite astonishingly, held a press conference in which he apologized for making a mistake. And the other day, he issued another statement saying that the commanders of Israeli police are confused because the Minister of Homeland Security is instructing them or giving them orders directly, something that is not allowed to do by law. But he says, but I won the elections. What do you mean I can't do that? And that's their answer to everything you say. But we won the elections. We get to do what we want. And we really don't care about your rights as minorities. We're going to take care of our own. We were elected to execute and govern. That's what they say. And it's true. Oh, another thing that they say, which is very interesting, they always bring up the issue of the disengagement from Gaza. I'm talking about specifically about Ben Gvir and his crowd. Now, the disengagement, that's a wrong kind of comparison. Let me explain why. The disengagement from Gaza, however controversial and painful, was a legitimate policy of the Israeli government, and the Israeli government had the right to execute it. Here, this is not about any given policy. We're talking about an attempt to change the DNA of the state of Israel. It's not about policy. Huge difference. They were not elected. They were elected to introduce policies, to execute their policy. They were not elected to change the DNA of the country. And that's why when you go out to the demonstrations, you see a lot of people that voted for the right wing. And that's why the demonstrators adopted the Israeli flag as their symbol. Because they say, we are the real nationalists here. We are the real Israelis here. We are the real patriots here. So that's the second Netanyahu ouster scenario. A third scenario is that the demonstration will put so much pressure on Netanyahu's coalition that is already beginning to show signs of instability, and that will lead to early elections. It's another scenario. It could happen. It certainly could happen if within Likud there's a break, and there's tremendous pressure applied on several members within Likud that are being viewed by the public as more moderate. And lastly, which is a scenario that President Herzog is trying to promote, of a compromise. What does it mean? A compromise. Let's begin a discussion about, how do we get out of this? And I give this scenario high chances, high probability, simply because at one point Mr. Netanyahu will understand that would be the only way to stop the demonstrations, is to begin a discussion. As long as there is no discussion, the demonstrations are getting bigger and bigger, and people are angrier and angrier. And I've never seen anything like it in all my life. How people are angry. They're angry. And my concern is at the end of the day, that anger will be directed at the ultra-Orthodox. Now, the ultra-Orthodox are in it just for the ride. It serves their purpose. Obviously, they don't support democracy. They have other sources of authority. Although some of my ultra-Orthodox friends do support democracy and believe it's a good system. But if you look at the public opinion surveys, 75% of the Israeli public, and some surveys, 80% of the Israeli public, is against the proposed revolution. The 20% that are in favor are mostly Orthodox people or ultra-Orthodox people. And the reason why they're in favor ranges from, again, we won the elections, we need to govern, all the way to, who said that Israel needs to be a democracy? Even the late Sheldon Adelson said it. On record, he said, it says nowhere that Israel needs to be a democracy. He said it. And he expressed the sentiment of many people. But when you look at that situation, it's very, very interesting, because out of this whole mess, a new political camp was created. And Mr. Netanyahu is the chief architect of that political camp. And if I may make a prediction, that political camp is going to be the most dominant political camp in the near future in Israel, and that is the pro-democracy camp. Traditionally, what defined the contours of the Israeli political discussion where issues such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right or left, were defined by where you stood on the issue of territorial compromise. More broadly, the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Iran issue, which is now more and more being perceived by the Israeli public as an attempt by Mr. Netanyahu to divert attention from the real thing. But really, the defining question today, and that's refreshing, because in the pro-democracy camp, you find representatives of every group in Israel, maybe with the exception of the ultra-Orthodox, but you certainly find Orthodox people. You see them in the demonstrations. You see members of almost any and every group in Israel. And that's refreshing. It's very, very interesting. And I think that this is really, if I may conclude on this issue with a positive note. But before that, how Israel will look like as a non-liberal democracy. So you can expect tremendous international pressure. There'll be tremendous internal pressure from the Israelis themselves, as it's happening now. You'll see a lot of infighting between groups within Israel and outside of Israel, within the Jewish community, no question about it. And that can also turn into violence. Israel will face diplomatic isolation. Foreign investments will be in danger. It's already happening, by the way. This is not something that is theoretical. It's already happening. Israel's academic excellence will be diminished, and there's going to be a real brain drain. Brain drains have a very peculiar tendency to happen slowly and quietly. And it's not going to be dramatic. We will not again, I mentioned the group I addressed yesterday was mostly people that came to Israel from South Africa. And I gave them the South African example of how South African Jewry went from 120, 130,000 people to 60,000 in less than a decade. It was not announced. People quietly left South Africa. And South Africa lost some of its greatest talent in the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. Ukraine. One of the reasons Ukraine is struggling so much is because Ukraine post USSR, post the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine lost over 40% of its population. We call it brain drain. 40% of the population left. It's huge. And again, countries are not going to succeed. They're not going to thrive. There are no examples of thriving economies that are not liberal democracies. Take Spain. Up until 1975, under Franco, Spain was struggling. It was the poorest country in Europe. It was considered to be the dumping zone of Europe. Ugly, industrial. Look what happened. Spain today is an economic miracle. It's the second largest draw in Europe for tourists after France. One of the strongest country brands in the world. Look at Korea. Look at, I can give you many, many examples. Going into the future, what can we expect for the next 75 years? So, we already spoke here about the issue of water. And it's true that Israel can be very proud of the fact that Israel was able to solve its own water problems. And water was the number one existential issue facing the pioneers that came to the land of Israel. Today, Israel is able to produce all the water that it needs. However, water will play a role going forward, not just for Israel, more importantly for Israel's neighbors. And Israel will have to engage in what I call water diplomacy in the next 75 years, and to leverage the miracle of Israel's independence in the field of water production to become a player in the Middle East and beyond. The real game is going to be not oil, water in the Middle East. Even now, we know that our neighbors are suffering from acute shortage of water, particularly Jordan, our neighbor right here, 5 million people. The refugees from Syria have no water. Egypt is struggling with water, and I can go on and on and on, and countries in the secondary circle. So water is going to be a big issue in the next 75 years. I mentioned natural gas. So Israel is discovered those huge deposits. If Israel will mishandle the deposits, Israel will be endangering the future of next generations. What Israel needs to do is, as Israeli governments, even under Mr. Netanyahu, promised that they will create a sovereign fund that will be called the Wealth Fund of Israel. That hasn't happened yet. But Israel has lots of natural gas. Israel is in a position to export natural gas, and the expectation is that the next 75 years, Israel will amass tremendous wealth as a result of the natural gas deposit that were discovered in the last 15 years. A little bit about Israel's future going forward. How will Israel look like by 2048? Very quickly, because we're running out of time. Population-wise, we're expected to be almost 18 million people. Right now, we're 9.6 million people. When I was born, 1962, we're a little bit over 2 million people. When I was 11 years old during the 73 war, we were 3.5 million people. Look at the growth, unprecedented growth. Look, this is 1948. This is what we're projected to be when we are 100. Israel's population is growing over 2% a year. That's huge. Most of the countries in Europe are actually declining in population. So this is going to be the breakdown. If today 33% of Israel's, if in 2018, 33% of Israel's population was Haredi and Arab, then by 2048, we're projected to have 44% of Israel's population Haredi and Arab, out of which the Haredi will be 3.5 million people. The Arabs will be 3.15 million people, and the rest of the Jewish population will be around 8.5 million people. In terms of how many Jews will live in Israel in the future, so by 2030, if you exclude the settlers, you're looking at 77% of Israel's population will be Jewish. What will be the age? The biggest group will be age 20 to 64. And when you look at the productivity, the fertility rate, in 2048, the fertility rate among Haredi will go down from 6.7 in 2018 to 5.9 in 2048. The fertility rate will also go down among Arabs from 3.02 to 2.5% to 2.5 children, and among Jews it remains more or less the same. In terms of immigration to Israel, the number of newcomers every year on average was about 25,000. It's projected to be around 17,000. Here I should say that what they're not telling us is how many of the newcomers of the Olim are actually going back to wherever they came from after a year or two. That number is pretty significant. Life expectancy, women are projected within our lifetime to live up to 90 years old. That's the good news. Men, well, I have, good news, but not as good as women. In terms of where those Israelis will live, those 18 million Israelis. So here is again, to show the genius of Theodor Herzl. So obviously Tel Aviv will remain the main hub with 6.3 million people. This is 2048. But number two emerges Haifa, the same fisherman village that Theodor Herzl wrote about in 1902. And he predicted in 1902 that Haifa would become a hub. And he was right. So Haifa will attract almost 3 million people. 45% of them will be Arabs. And Jerusalem will attract 1.7 million people. 25% of them will be Arabs. Last word before we open for discussion. we have a global consensus today that what really is the number one asset is not oil, is not gold, it's not salt. Salt used to be the number one asset. It's human creativity. And if we put this in danger, the ability of Israeli society to be free, to be critical, they have no boundaries in terms of its ability to create. If we will put that ability to be so creative in danger, that we're endangering the future of the state of Israel. Israel's creativity serves as an inspiration to the whole world. Just today, I was hosting a delegation that came from Greece to look at Israeli technology. Israel's creativity is a huge success story. It turned Israel into an unparalleled success story. It's the reason why Israel demonstrated an exceptional level of resilience and perseverance over the years. Because as the cliche goes, necessity is the mother of all invention. And necessity pushes you, forces you to think creatively. And so by changing the DNA of the state of Israel, we're putting this very secret sauce element, Israel's creative spirit, we're putting this element in danger. And that's the real story here. That's the real story. I can give you a whole historical context for what's happening. The struggle between universalism in Judaism and particularism in Judaism. The two ends, right? If Theodor Herzl represented universalism, then what we're seeing now is the people that advocated Jewish particularism, not to say isolationism, are the ones having the upper hand. This is what you're seeing in Israel today. This is what the struggle. I believe that there is going to be a resolution one way or another. I think that it's going to be a painful process, but maybe, as a result of this process, Israel will begin a whole new conversation about drafting a constitution. Maybe Israel's democracy will emerge stronger than ever as a result of what's happening today. And I'm hearing more and more Israelis that in the beginning of this whole thing were very pessimistic. I'm hearing more and more Israelis that believe that we are actually on the threshold of a whole new chapter in Israel's democracy, in which Israel's democracy will emerge even stronger and more resilient. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for your questions, please. And I see that we have a couple of questions already submitted. Yeah. So the question comes from Chaya Gil. Is you said that the judiciary needs improvements. You also only mentioned. So look, there's many. First of all, there are lots of complaints about nepotism at the higher level. I'm not a great critic of that because I know the human nature. If your father's an architect, there are very high chances you'll be drawn to architecture as well. There is no nepotism here. If your father is a judge, you'll also aspire to be a judge. Statistically, that's happening all over the world. I don't think that's nepotism, but it bothers them. It bothers them. So that's the first thing. It's very visible. They say it's an elite, it's a clique. They appoint each other, and they show that there are actually stories in the newspapers about that. How the son of the former Supreme Court justice is also this and that. And you know what? Sometimes appearance has to be addressed. And so I would put in some elements to curb this perception of nepotism. But the most pressing issue is the lack of efficiency of the court system. Cases are being dragged for years. The quality of the judges, very low. You sit in front of them, you don't believe. Who are these people? We just had a story in the Israeli television yesterday about the former mayor of Rishon LeZion, who was accused wrongly of bribery, was brought in front of a judge, and the judge prolonged his arrest by saying by issuing a wrong statement, factually wrong. He said that his name is Dov Tzur. Mr. Dov Tzur has a record of contempt and has a record of this and none of that was true. That's a judge making a fundamental mistake, a mayor of the fourth largest city in Israel. Now, of course, that judge is not a bad guy. He's a good guy, not of very high quality. And you see that all over the country. So there is a real reform that is needed to fix the Israeli judiciary. Sadly, this is not what this coalition is trying to do. The coalition is trying very cynically to use that perception that the judiciary is broken to actually pass a revolution that will change Israel's DNA. That's what they're trying to do. And if someone is telling you that this is not what they're trying to do, either that person is lying to you or they generally don't understand where they live. Okay. Second question from Sharon Weiner. Israel from day one was fragile, but it worked for 75 years. Why do you think it happened now? That's from Eyal Sela, my dear friend from childhood. I think that the answer is happening now is because of, again, information overload. I mentioned it's Israel's Brexit moment. It's happening not only in Israel, it happened in the United States. It's happening in other countries in the world. This bombardment of information is driving us crazy. The human brain is incapable of dealing with it. And the solutions are people are just following populists and populist messages. And populist messages are very appealing because we lost the bandwidth. We lost the attention span. The attention span, if you're looking at what happened to the attention span since the introduction of electronic media, you can see how it was shortened with time, scientifically, that we are now, we can only fantasize about a 3-second attention span on the part of the media consumer, which I remember when people said it's 3 seconds, I was shocked. That was during the days of television. Now, it's all about brief images on TikTok and memes and so on. That's how people mediate. That's how reality is mediated to them. So obviously, when this is your medium, what is the complexity of the message that can be transmitted? Very limited in complexity. So as a result, the whole conversation is flat. No nuance. What is cancel culture? Inability to handle nuance. Think about it. Netanyahu. Doris Strauss is asking, what do I think about Netanyahu's travels? Well, I think it's a very alarming sign. If he chose, by the way, when he went to Italy for an extended weekend, which also happened to be his anniversary, although he didn't announce it, it's a very disturbing sign because that was a very bloody weekend in the West Bank. Lots of violence, and of course the protest. He gave a speech on television rather than addressing the pressing issues of the time. He devoted his speech to attack the media and to attack the protesters. The media, the most popular channel, cut him off. First time in history, they cut him off. So I think there's a good chance Mr. Netanyahu is severely isolated from reality, just like you had with Mr. Trump, surrounded by people that are telling him exactly what he wants to hear. and that's very dangerous in a democracy. Very, very dangerous. So I think that's a problem. It doesn't give us any indication that he's fully aware to the severity of the situation. Nahum Niv is asking me, what do I predict regarding the Palestinian issue? Well, for now, the Palestinian issue is pretty much off the table, and that's because of their own doing. They rejected all significant compromises that were proposed in the last 20 years, from the Clinton plan through the look at their reaction to the Gaza pullout, all the way to the Olmert plan. And so, and that's also one of the reasons Mr. Netanyahu was able to form a coalition all those years, is because Israelis came to the conclusion that the conflict with the Palestinians is not really about land, but rather over our right to exist. And that really decimated the entire political camp known as territorial compromise. So for now, I think the Palestinian issue is pretty much off the table. There's no point of going into a blame game. Whose fault is it that it's off the table? But that's the reality. And again, I don't believe that status quo is a good thing. In other words, I don't think that on the Palestinian issue, time is on our side. I don't believe that. Sharon is asking again, do you believe Israel can continue to sustain the support of the United States and the Western democracies? From David Levine. Well, the answer, of course, is United States has been very good about sticking with its national ethos. That's why they supported the protesters in the Tahrir Square 13 years ago, and basically deserted Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, who was a loyal ally, more or less, to the United States. They didn't do it because they were bad people. They did it because this is America's national ethos. They have to support those who support freedom. Their national ethos is about democracy and liberty. And therefore, if Mr. Netanyahu's coalition will pass resolutions that will negate the DNA of the United States, rest assured, the United States will not sit idly by. We already have indications. My good friend, U.S. Ambassador Tom Nides, is making statements that were never made by any U.S. ambassador before. Follow his statements. Unbelievable, but he has no choice. So there's no doubt in my mind that the relationship will be badly damaged, severely damaged, if they will continue with this proposed changes. Next question, my dear friend Melvin Holmes from Bourne, Massachusetts. Good to see you here, my dear friend. You believe that this revolution will remain peaceful? What will happen if not peaceful? So chances are it will remain peaceful, because Israelis are known for their ability to do that peacefully. It's true that we had one prime minister assassinated by an Orthodox Jew who was motivated and fueled by rabbinical fervor. On this case, you don't really have that influence of religion. So it's not about, I find it hardly to believe, I find it hard to believe that this will become into a mass riot, or that we should look at the scenario of, God forbid, another assassination. I don't think that's going to escalate to that, but it's going to be significant civil disobedience. They're very creative in what they're doing. I don't know if you're following what they're doing, but what their creativity is world class. For example, they had two gay men French kissing in front of police officers, and just challenging the police officer to try and remove them while they're kissing. They were kissing very passionately, by the way. They had they're blocking access to Mr. Netanyahu for the airport when he wants to travel abroad. They block the entrance to the airport, so they had to take him with a helicopter. they're making life very difficult for them, but they're doing it in a nonviolent way. So I don't think that it will become violent. Last question. Why do the numbers you shared show fertility going down? Well, usually when fertility goes down, it's a function of higher levels of education and more income. Israel is climbing up. When you look at the GDP per capita, Israel is a member of the OECD. The OECD is the elite club of economies in the world. And Israel joined the OECD in 2010. And in order for you to make it to become a member of the OECD, you have to meet certain criteria. One of the criteria is GDP per capita per annum. And Israel's GDP per capita per annum, meaning which is the average amount of money every Israeli is earning a year, is going up. And we're already above most of the European countries, and we are fast reaching the American standard. So that's, I think, the main reason why you see fertility going down. When people have more education, when they're more comfortable economically, they also have a tendency to bring less children. And the source for this information is Israel's Ministry of Finance, the Strategic Planning Division. And on this note, I'd like to thank all of you again for your participation in this series.
Ido, let us thank you once again for another informative, insightful, inspiring presentation. This entire series has increased our knowledge of Israel and has enriched our relationship with our homeland. Thank you for the passion you brought to this series and for the time you put into preparing the slides for each session. While this is the last session in the Israel at 75 program, we look forward to hosting many more programs with you. Viewers, I invite you to send me suggestions for topics. You can do this by responding to the email you will receive tomorrow asking for your feedback. Thanks again to Dr. David M. Milch Foundation for your generous support of this series with Ido Aharoni. We are deeply appreciative of your support for our work. Our 2023 annual campaign has launched. Our programs are free and open to everyone thanks to the generous support of hundreds of donors to our annual campaign. Consider this my request of everyone attending the program to support Lapin Foundation with a donation of any amount to our annual campaign. It's easy to donate at lapinfoundation.org. We are working hard to meet our ambitious goal of $600,000, which will enable us to develop and deliver enriching, life-changing programs for individuals of all ages. Please join the hundreds of individuals who support our work with a gift of any amount. I thank everyone for attending this evening's program. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night, everyone. Thanks again, Ido.
Thank you.
Night.